Good morning, everyone. Corey Hughes, Bloody History. So, we've gotten to the Tarasoffs. I'm kind of, I don't know what to say about them. They seem to be at the very core of this thing in Mexico City. So we're just going to pick up where we left off yesterday. You have Mr. Bruton talking to Mr. Tarasoff, Mr. and Mrs. Tarasoff. Remember, this is the 1976 interview where they interviewed them together. Now, from a law enforcement perspective, you never do that ever. Not once. Ever. Period. Fucking ever. You always separate witnesses or suspects. All right. Mr. Bruton says, all right, if we could have that now at any time in this conversation, did Lee Harvey Oswald, were you able to identify to whom he was speaking? I myself wouldn't, because I had very little contact with the transcribing of the reels. That would actually be my husband's duties, is Ms. Tarasoff saying this, to recognize the voices. Now, if your husband recognized the voice of the person inside, would he on the transcript then identify the person? Definitely. It would also be on the transcript. So-and-so spoke to so-and-so. That was normal procedure then. Yes, if you could identify the two parties that were speaking to each other, then you would also transcribe the names, including the names in the transcript. Now, if in this case, do you recall whether or not the person to whom Lee Harvey Oswald was speaking was identified? I don't really know. All right. Because if I was doing the typing of it, and if I came to it, I would automatically rerun the reel in order for Boris to listen to if he could recognize who he was speaking to. I don't recall whether he did recognize who he was speaking to or not, but there was also a close resemblance to several voices that sounded alike in the embassy amongst the people who were speaking. So sometimes it was very hard to identify the people. I think there was 3 that almost had the same tone of voice and speaking habits. Would it have been the normal procedure? Well, it would have sort of been, to be very easy, let's say, to weed out who the English-speaking people were, because there were very few that spoke English, so... But on this particular tape, do either of you remember being able to identify the person to whom Lee Harvey Oswald was speaking? Unfortunately not. All right, sir. And you did not, I take it then, if you could not identify the person, that you would not have put any name on the transcript of someone that he had been speaking to. Do you remember putting any names on it? Well, if you were not certain, you would put the name and you would put it in parentheses. That's what we did. And we had a question mark. A question mark, I think. Now, if you couldn't identify the person, what would you put? What would you use? Initials or... No, we just put down the men outside, or if the call comes in, that's if it's the men outside. If somebody calls from the embassy and we don't know his name, we can't identify him or recognize his voice, then we put down MI or men inside. All right, do you recall in this case, or if... Strike that. We're going to have to change tapes here, so let's go off the record, and they do that. Were either of you ever asked at any time for your opinion as to the identity of the individual to whom Lee Harvey Oswald was speaking on that tape, on that second tape? I don't think anybody asked us that. Well, if they asked me, I wouldn't know, because to begin with, I never worked on the tapes constantly to have any sufficient amount of time to recognize voices. That would be Boris's, my husband's part. He would be the one who would be able to identify whoever was speaking, if it was possible to identify them. Now, sir, you have shown some Huron copy set papers, which is carbon set, and you stated that you made an original and 2 copies of all your transcripts that you had translated and transcribed with respect to the Oswald tape. Did you do the same thing with that tape? That is, make an original and 2 copies. That's a rule. We always did that. Before it used to be 3 copies, but then they saw that there was no need to make so many, so they came down to the original and 2 copies. Now, sir, do you recall what happened do either of you recall what happened once you had, the second Oswald tape transcribed? What happened when did you make the call to someone, or what? Well, after transcribing and typing it up and the name was mentioned, and as we said previously, there was some indication from the on the reel that this could be of interest or very pertinent, so we had contacted or contact that we had for any emergency of this type. Do you recall who that was? Well, I wouldn't want to mention the name if you don't mind. It was just a phone number, and sometimes it would just be passed on, the message, in case the party was not there. All right. Let me, without trying to pry further, is that person still an employee of the CIA? Oh, yes. Is that person still employed by the CIA? That I wouldn't know. That much I wouldn't know. But you called this unidentified person? Yes. And what transpired then? Well, they in turn would pass by the house and pick it up and take it to the embassy. And then Mr. Tarasoff says, no, I took the reel and transcription to a corner. I remember that. And Mrs. Tarasoff says, oh, you took it personally. I thought they came by and picked it up. Because as by a rule, they would come by and pick it up. And Mr. Tarasoff says, probably it must have been the other one. See, these people are just fucking talking in circles. Now, do you recall that on the same day that you got that tape, that you transcribed that tape and it was delivered to someone that day? The same day. The same day, very shortly after it had been finished. All right, sir. Now, that was an original and 2 copies. Would either of you be able to identify the original transcript if you saw it? Yes, because there was a certain procedure on how you type it up. All right. Would you be able to determine at this point, 13 years later, if you saw the original, whether or not it had been altered in any way from what you recall typing? That would be hard to determine because actually the transcript was made verbatim. Whatever one party said, that was what was typed. Whatever the other party said also was typed. There wasn't anything put in other than what was both people talking to. Mr. Bruton says there were no editorial comments. Mrs. Tarasoff says no, none whatsoever. And I believe you said, sir, nothing was taken out? No, there was nothing omitted and nothing added. They asked for verbatim. You got to put everything in it. Whether they said oh or ah or everything. Now, you delivered that. Did you ever use any, in the transcription of those tapes, did you ever use any code words or any phrases or anything like that that you would add to it? No. You would just use your MI for the man inside and MO for man outside. Those were the only 2. Abbreviations? Well, I used to first, when a person was identified, let's say a Russian name, instead of putting down every time a Russian name said this, went here and did that, I would put down, looks like YAT, Y-A-T. An abbreviation. Yes, it saves time and work and whatnot. Now, you personally handed the tape and the original and 2 copies to this person who was your contact. If I delivered it, I did. All right, sir. If it was picked up, maybe. The same thing, whether it was delivered or picked up, they would have the tape. Yes, but would it be you or me? Oh, no, it wouldn't be me, says Mrs. Tarasoff. Mr. Tarasoff said, I mean, if they came to the house. And then Mrs. Tarasoff says, well, it didn't matter because 9 out of 10 times they'd want to talk to you anyway. Mr. Bruton then said, either way, it would be personally delivered to. Oh, yes, it would be from hand to hand. And then after you delivered that transcript and the tape, did you any time subsequent to that ever see the transcript again or hear the tape again? No, none whatsoever. On cases of that nature, which were sensitive, like the Oswald case, was it a normal procedure to save certain tapes? No, not that we can recollect. I don't think that we ever saved any tapes. No, but I don't mean you saved. I mean the CIA saved. That I don't know. Whatever left our house, they picked up. And then Mr. Tarasoff says, the minute it leaves our hands, and then Ms. Tarasoff cuts him off, they could have erased everything, or they could have saved everything, or we don't know. As I say, whatever left our hands and went into the hands of the other party, we never knew what happened. Whether they kept it, erased it, burned it, or destroyed the whole works, we never knew this. Do you know anything about the filing system, how they file these transcripts? Did either one of you ever have anything to do with that? No. Wait, no, this was at first I was filling it, taking the original. With respect to the typing of this, would you describe for me the type of portable typewriter you would use? If I was using my portable typewriter, it's a Royal typewriter, and it's kind of a brownish beige. All right. And if it was a typewriter that was issued by the company, then I don't remember whether it was standard, then it would be on that. But many a time we would have breakage of a tape recorder typewriter, so we'd have to improvise every now and then. Mr. Bruton then said, now, did you get, I don't know if you want to reveal this one, but that one name, but was the person who picked up the Oswald tape the same person you received the tape from? 9 out of 10 times, yes. Most likely, yes. All right, with respect to CIA personnel within the embassy, I'm talking about a subsequent to the assassination of President Kennedy. Did any person from the CIA ever contact either of you about that particular tape or your transcription of the Oswald tape at any time? I think my answer should be negative, but I may have to qualify that statement. Do you remember if Herb ever mentioned it to us? Herb being Herb Manel. About the recall on tapes. No, not the recall. I mean about the whole business. No, in fact, I think, I don't think Herb was there then. Are you speaking about Herb Manel? Yes, I don't think he was there then because shortly after we came, he was from the first because I had dealings the minute I came. Yes, but the thing is that shortly after he was transferred. He was actually there for quite a while. All right, well, time went by. Well, anyway, no, we weren't. Mr. Tarasoff then says, I was at a meeting at his house shortly after I came because I said that the load they had put on me is tremendous. I just cannot do this, not humanly possible. So he said, don't worry about it. Have the Spanish transcribers do the Spanish part of it. Now, did anyone from the agency or the federal government from the Warren Commission, anyone ever talk to you or discuss with you the translation of the Oswald tapes? No, that's a negative. Absolutely no one. In 13 years, no one has talked to you. Not even the embassy employees or the officials at the time where our employers reproached us on the subject. Now, ma'am, I just need some more information from you, just for purposes of identification. Your full name is... My name is Anna Tarasoff. And your address, Mrs. Tarasoff? Rancho Contento, Guadalajara, Mexico. And your date of birth, May 5th, 23. And your social security number, if you remember it. No, I don't. And what is your occupation or profession? Right now, I'm just a housewife. All right. Are you retired from any of the federal government or, well, I'm semi-retired, I should say. All right. From which agency? CIA. All right. How long did you work there? For the CIA? Oh, I was employed as of April of 1957, and then I was picked up, and I had actually a year off duty when we were transferred to Mexico City, and then I was picked up on a contract, and from, I would say, 64 until 70, and that was the length of my duty with CIA. Now, did you know in the embassy or did you ever have contacts? I'm going to ask you about a number of or some names with Ann Goodpasture. I know Ann Goodpasture, but I didn't have any dealings with her. Did Ann Goodpasture ever bring tapes back and forth as a courier type of a person and pick up transcripts and stuff to your recollection? And I think Ann did it once when Charlie or something went wrong. I think she brought it once, if I'm not mistaken. But were, as far as you know, or as far as you may remember, that wasn't her duty. That wasn't her duty? No. All right. It was just a fill-in, and if there was for some other reason. What about Clark Anderson? Did you know Clark Anderson in the embassy? I'm not sure about his first name, but I knew Mr. Anderson. He was the legal attaché. I met him when I was there on TDY. Okay. We had a meeting at his home, and we talked about the furniture that he had made. That's about all I can tell you about him, if that's the same person, but his name wasn't, his family name was Anderson. Whether he was Clark or somebody else, I don't know. What about a Mr. Phillips? Did you know Mr. Phillips on the Cuban desk? No, neither of them did. All right, do you know Mr. and Mrs. Minnell? Minnell sounds, yes. All right, and how closely did you work for 1963 until 1970? How closely did you work and associate with people from the embassy? Well, directly work with them? Oh, you mean dealing in an official capacity? Yes. I don't think we ever attempted anything like that. All right. Just socially sometimes. That was rarely because they were skeptical, very cagey about having us being seen with them and vice versa. So I don't know. It was the chief's idea that we shouldn't be socializing with the inside people since we were on the outside for some reason or other. What, did you have any particular type of cover or anything? How did that appear to your friends and associates that you were doing in Mexico City? Well, most of our friends and associates were CIA people anyway, so if we were sent overseas, you didn't have to tell them. They could more or less guess on their own or put two and two. Besides, when we were talking about the company, well, I'm giving out a very deep and sinister secret. You always refer to the company as a pickle factory. Hold on a second. Hang on a fucking second. Mr. Tarasoff makes this sentence, and we're going to steal it. Besides, when we were talking about company, well, I'm giving out a very deep and sinister secret. You always refer to the company as Pickle Factory. Okay? To my friends in the chat, I never want to see the word CIA in my fucking chat again. From now on, it's the Pickle Factory. Okay? Mr. Tarasoff then says, we now wrote letters to each other and we'd put down PF. They knew what we were talking about. Did you ever see any? Did either of you ever see any transcripts of any tapes from Spanish involving Oswald? Spanish? Spanish? She used to read the whole thing and see if it's pertinent. Did you explain your functions? No, he started to ask me, but I didn't finish because he had to change the tape. I want to go into some of your functions when you came to Mexico. When I first came to Mexico, the first few months, I was told I could help Boris because there was such a backlog of work that he was left on his shoulders when his predecessors left. And so, since I was employed by CIA, there was no reason for them to not say yes because they didn't have to worry about a clearance. So I was helping out with filing and more or less putting into category in order. It's very important that the part that she played in it. And because I filed according to the date of the reel, and the reel itself had a number, and then following that, each conversation had a number, and that would be the original copy that I would file as in it is in whole. Then the carbon copy would also be kept in its original state. And the second one, I would sort of scan it over and just delete what was not pertinent. Like it was a conversation with somebody saying, well, tomorrow I'm going downtown. Do you want to go with me? I'll pick you up at such and such a date and time, or I'm having lunch at, or it's a phone call and they said no one is here and hangs up. But if it had anything to do with two people, and especially if their names were mentioned, this was cut out and it was pasted on a piece of paper. And it was turned over into our contact. In the morning, it was handed to the same person that delivered, and it was delivered then to the people at the embassy. And from there, I guess they filed it according to their own system. At first, they wanted everything, and then they found out why a million times somebody's dialing for the time, and sometimes somebody's calling to see if their husbands come in. And so they said that this was just a waste of time to try to file all this. And we're looking for is people that actually carry on conversations with each other, especially if they're identifying each other. Actually, if it was left to your discretion, yes, to throw away all the unnecessary, all the rubbish, because they were trying to do this at the embassy and they found out that it was taking up too much of their time for work that is more pertinent than just sitting and just cutting little pieces of paper. And so they decided that it would be up to me to use my common sense and see what was pertinent and what was not pertinent. And as I say, I would put it on a piece of paper and they in turn filed it. And if they had comments to make on it, they would make their own personal comments. But on these tapes, you didn't, and on these things that you didn't put your own, no personal comments. There was no comment made on my part. Well, I believe that is all the questions I have for right now. My colleague has prepared some questions relating to some areas that I haven't covered, and so I'm going to shut the tapes off, and we'll let them come around to this side of the table. Mr. Blackmer then says, Mr. Tarasoff, I'm going to ask you a few questions concerning specifics of your function in Mexico City in '63. Between the periods of September and November, I understand your answers to Mr. Bruton's questions that your responsibility was to translate and transcribe intercepts of telephone conversations coming into Soviet embassy in Mexico City and going out of the embassy in Mexico City. Coming in and going out of the Soviet embassy during the course of your employment, did you become familiar with many of the voices of the people at the embassy? Oh, yes, you gradually begin to realize who they are and the way they talk, and you associate yourself very closely with them after a while, but it takes time, unfortunately. Is it not a fact that these Russians were cautious when they spoke on the telephone? Oh, yes, very definitely. Didn't they usually identify themselves by name? No. So therefore, it was really necessary for you to become familiar so you could place them. Unless, of course, a certain person asked whoever answered the telephone for another Soviet individual, whoever he might be. And then the name would come up and you'd be able to identify them? Yes, I don't think it happened very often. All right, sir, can I ask you if there were any particular individuals that you could instantly recognize their voices? Well, Yakinov was one of them. And then Yukenrikov, it's a riot, I tell you. So you recognized instantly certain voices of individuals, and I see that you have a scrapbook in front of us, and in it, it seems to be photographs of people in the Soviet delegation here in Mexico City. Is that the Soviet delegation? Soviet embassy in Mexico City. You have various names in different sections. You state on top who these people were and where they were in the embassy. What I could scrounge out, because I asked for the photographs, I said, how am I going to tell who if I don't see what the heck he looks like? And Herb told me, he said, try and work without pictures and give me a report on them, what you think of each of them. And first one apparently was so successful that he was jumping with joy. I kind of cheated a little bit. I saw the picture of the person I was describing. All right, sir, so they kept you in the dark and you made clippings from newspapers and got various photographs. Later, they relented and let me see the pictures. All right, let me move into a specific area. Are you familiar with one Pavel Antonovich Yatskov? Yatskov. Do you know this individual? Well, yes, and we have his pictures. You have his pictures, and do you recall being transcribed telephone conversations in which Mr. Yatskov was one of the people on the telephone, so you would recognize his voice? I imagine I would, but as I said before, I'm not sure about anything right now. Well, back then, constantly doing these transcripts, oh yes, then you pick it up. You know exactly who it is. So this man is not unfamiliar to you. Yeah, it's off. No, he made many phone calls. Now you explained to me that, let me ask you if this is correct. Someone speaking Russian, that voice sounds in a certain way, and the same person speaking English might not sound the same. Is that correct? That's correct, because the person who speaks English uses very stilted languages and long pauses between words and so forth, and it sounds mechanical to me. This is a Russian speaking English? Yes, a Russian speaking English. All right, and you, I understand from reviewing the Oswald tape when you were transcribing the 2 telephone conversations, do you have an opinion right now as to whether Yatskov was one of was the party that Mr. Oswald was speaking to on these 2 occasions? I doubt it very much, because by comparing the pictures, I would say that it's not the same person. But had you ever heard Yatskov speak English? That I cannot answer. Were you aware that he could speak English? That I don't know. You don't know, but you did recall many conversations with Yatskov in Russian. Oh, yes. All right. Do you believe that you stated that you doubt very seriously if Yatskov was one of the parties speaking? Now I ask you if you are familiar with a Kostakov, Valery Vladimirovich Kostakov. Valery Vladimirovich Kostakov. Do you know Mr. Kostakov? I transcribed some of his calls before the Oswald calls, most likely. So are you familiar with Mr. Kostakov's voice speaking Russian? Is that true? Well, that is if I remember it correctly. Can you tell me whether or not you had ever recalled Mr. Kostakov speaking in English? No, if a person was speaking in English, I doubt if I would know him. Can you recall any conversation in which these high-ranking Russians, you did know their function? Did you know they were secret police, Yatskov and Kostakov? Well, eventually I got to know them who's who. I think they have that list of them. Turning to his wife, he asked, do you remember? You were given a list of all the Soviet embassy employees and their status as to whether they were secretary, treasurer, or the one at the gate answering the phone, and they also issued certain information if they were able to prove it. Suspected KGB, and suspected operator they had, so this list was furnished. Could you tell me if you had this list before the Oswald conversation? Well, this list was furnished practically every time they had a changeover of personnel. Did you know at the time of the Oswald conversation that Kostakov was a member of the KGB? Oh, I can't remember. I can't really swear to that. But this was also indicated on this list that you got whether they were KGB or not. If they suspected that they had proof, they would put it in a question mark. Do you recall this man Kostakov as having been one? No, that I wouldn't know. All right. You have to realize one thing. There were 15 employees plus their wives who chatted on the phone, so actually there were quite a number of people to take care of. It was almost impossible to realize who's who unless you get to know their voices perfectly. All right, can I ask you if you're familiar with Antonovich Konstantinov? Konstantinov. Do you know Konstantinov? Well, I heard them on the tape. Do you know what position he had in the embassy? Absolutely no. Do you recall whether he was suspected of being a KGB official? Yes, I was told that he was. You were told he was KGB. That he was confirmed KGB. Confirmed KGB? Do you know when you found this out? Pardon me? Do you know what period of time it was that you found this out? No. You don't know whether it was before or after the Oswald phone call? No. Do you recall the name of Kostin? It sounds familiar, but again, as I say, I doubt it. Did you ever come across the name Kostin, Mrs. Tarasoff? No, unless they, what they've done, abbreviated it. You're fluent in Russian, sir. Does that look to you like it could be in any way an abbreviation of either the name Kostakov or Yatskov or Konstantinov? Would someone familiar with the language of Russian use that as an abbreviation of any of those names? I'm completely at a loss here. It sounds Russian, I know. It sounds Russian, but you don't know the individual. No, I don't recollect, frankly. Do you know of any of the high-ranking officials in the Soviet embassy, whether they spoke English on the telephone conversations, or did they speak Russian mostly? Oh, they spoke Russian, very seldom. Did you have English? Very seldom, and then usually I called upon her, Mrs. Tarasoff, to verify my idea. Whatever they were talking about, sometimes their English was so bad that it was impossible to make heads or tails of it. I would like to ask you if you can state an opinion as to whether or not you think the party was talking to Mr. Oswald on the two conversations that you intercepted. Were any of the individuals we just discussed, Kastov, Kostakov, Konstantinov, or Kostin, did you know for a fact whether Mr. Oswald spoke with any of these individuals? Well, my unconfirmed guess would be that it must have been either Kostakov or Konstantinov. Well, that's for the simple reason out of the whole group that was the embassy, there were only about two that really spoke English well enough where they could carry on a conversation. And those two would be these two people, Konstantinov and Konstantinov. Because the others were sort of beginner, a word here or there, but they couldn't carry on a conversation. In fact, if a phone call was made and an American was calling trying to get some information, well, even the party at the gate that would be there or at the switchboard, they would hardly understand what they were trying to say. They would try to tell them in Spanish that they don't understand them, or telling them in Russian or in Spanish that they would finally hang up, because even the party at the switchboard very seldom knew English. So you could boil it down to how many there were that really spoke English well enough that they could carry on a conversation. All right. I understand that you have made voice tapes. Could you describe to me what you did and why that was done? Well, first of all, I wanted to familiarize myself with the way each member of the embassy was talking. Secondly, if I had somebody doing my work for me after I was transferred, or for any other reason, that they would listen to the voices of the Soviet embassy employees and figure out who was talking. And in order to build up a library, let's say, of the voice prints, so consequently, they had quite a number of these spools, empty spools from 8mm movies. I used those for cutting off a section of tape and then winding it on the spool, and then my wife would mark it and put a piece of paper identifying each voice when it was spoken and so forth. After a while, we would run out of it because there were so many different voices, so we had to go Kodak store, and we bought a whole mess of these empty reels. You deal with anybody at the embassy who was on this voice taping? No, I sent them notice to the effect to the embassy. I said that it would be a good idea. They didn't think so at first, but then remember, I think it was Herb that said actually take the voice samples. So you definitely communicated this to Herb Manel. I think so. That's who it was. Can you tell me a little bit more about the voice identity tapes that you made when you left the employment? Did you turn them over to anyone in the embassy? Oh, yes. After we had a full box of them, then we had to turn them over. Do you remember who picked them up? Probably one of the boys. Well, we were leaving. Mrs. Tarasoff says, well, when we were leaving, all the equipment went. There were a couple of them that came out, and Charlie came out, and who was the other fellow who came out with them and took them? The one who brought the dictionaries for you. Oh, Dan Vogel. Yes, he took some of the stuff. I'm sorry, Dan Vogel? His name in what, sir? His name's in the book, The CIA Diary. Dan Vogel was someone that you gave these voice identify tapes to. Yes. All right, guys, let's pull everything on Dan Vogel, Vogel. Mrs. Tarasoff, yes. Mr. Blackmer, I see. Do you know if these tapes are still in existence? That I have no idea. Mr. Blackman then says, I'd like to show you a memorandum, sir. It's dated 16th of October, 1963. It is a teletype message to the ambassador concerning Lee Harvey Oswald's contact with the Soviet Union. I'd like to read for you this paragraph, and I want you to ask you if you think it's a fair representation of the information that you transmitted to CIA headquarters during the time you transcribed the Oswald tape. If we can, we have a minor delay. If we can cut off just for a moment and we can return. Mrs. Tarasoff, Mr. Tarasoff, I was going to give you the information that's contained in October 16th, 1973 CIA memo to the ambassador. It also has carbon copies to Immigration and Naturalization, Navy, Legal Attaché, Regional Security Officers, Counselor for Political Affairs in the Ministry. This is information that was sent to these different agencies concerning Mr. Oswald's appearance in Mexico City in the period September to October 1965. Means 1963. It says sick, 1963, so it's an error there. And I'll just read it, and I'll just try to emphasize the part that when discussing Mr. Oswald, this memo starts, the following information was received, and, of course, the source is blanked out, on October 1st, 1963. Now I want to read this following information, and tell me if you think there is anything more in the transcripts than what's contained in the message. An American male contacted the Soviet embassy and identified himself as Lee Oswald. Is that correct so far? Is that basically what you had in the transcript? Yes. This officer determined that Oswald had been at the Soviet embassy on the 26th or 28th. unclear, September 1963, and had talked with Kostkov, a member of the counselor section. Now, do you know for a fact whether he was at the Soviet embassy? Hey guys, while it's on my mind, let's pull everything in relation to the alleged bus ride that Oswald took to Mexico City. We know nobody was on that fucking bus except some spooks, right? Kerry Thornley wasn't on it because he flew in with David Pierce Magyar, and it wasn't fucking Oswald. So we need to pull everything on the bus ride for Oswald's trip to Mexico City. All right, so let me continue. Now, do you know for a fact whether or not he was at the Soviet embassy? We could never know that. No. You never knew that. And do you know for a fact whether or not he talked to Kostkov on the telephone? Well, as I said before, it's a very doubtful proposition, and we could jump at conclusions all weekend. But you don't know for a fact that he did. Not as a fact. Mr. Oswald's contact was done in order to learn if the Soviet embassy had received a reply from Washington concerning his Oswald's request. Now, do you know if in the conversation intercept whether he was requesting something? If I can remember, I think he was requesting financial help to go back to either Cuba or to Russia. You don't recall whether or not being, and he's interrupted, but he needs financial assistance because he didn't have any money. Do you recall whether he asked the Soviet embassy people if they had received replies from some previous request he'd made? No. That is the information. So is there any more information that you know from the transcripts about Mr. Oswald's telephone conversation? Is there more than is mentioned in the paragraph I just read to you? And if so, what else did you know? Well, I couldn't really rely on my memory, but I know the conversation was quite lengthy. In fact, the transcript must have been at least a couple of pages or two and half pages because it had to have been done verbatim, word for word. It wasn't just listening to it and then you making a summary. It was a verbatim transcript made of both parties speaking to each other. Well, was there any more in the context of what went on in that conversation other than the fact that he just wanted to know if he'd gotten a request back from the Soviets? Did he ask for anything? Do you recall that he asked for anything? Did he ask for a visa? That I wouldn't swear to, but I know he was requesting financial help because he said he was just out of money. So that much is very clear. Do you remember he at last asked for some financial help? And he wanted to speak to someone in the embassy who would be able to finance, I guess, give him money. Did he indicate that he wanted to leave Mexico? Oh, definitely. He didn't want to stay. Well, I know that he didn't want to stay in Mexico because he was going to leave. If he could get the results from one of the embassies, the Cuban or Soviet embassy, he wasn't about to stay in Mexico. Did you know this from the transcript, or is this from some other knowledge that you had gained since then? I don't know whether that was in the transcript or whether it was something that came through another source. Can I ask you if you can recall from the transcript, either one of you, whether or not he said he wanted to go to Cuba or to Russia? You said he wanted to get out of Mexico. Did the transcript, can you recall from the transcript, did he indicate where he wanted to go? He wanted to leave Mexico. Where did he want to go? If any place, he would go back to Russia because his wife is of Russian extraction, and this is the one reason it puzzled both Boris and I that although he married a Russian, why was she given permission to leave the country when it's so difficult for others to leave? So there must be some sort of, there must have been some sort of an angle there while he married a Russian girl and lived there. I believe it was 3 or 4 years. While we're on this record, let's not get into opinions. I want to get anything that you can recall having seen on the transcript that indicated where he wanted to go. You say he wanted financial aid, that he was broke. Did it indicate where he wanted to go? He really didn't care. He wanted to go to either Cuba or Russia. Do you know that from the transcript? I would say that's exactly what he wanted, if I can remember, if I can rely on memory. And your memory of what was in the transcript, that he wanted to go to Cuba or to Russia. He didn't want to stay in Mexico, that was for sure. His purpose in coming to Mexico was to contact either one of the embassies because he couldn't get any results in Washington from the embassies. We want to stay only with the knowledge that you have based on what you transcribed. And you think that you transcribed something that indicated that he wanted to leave Mexico City and travel to Cuba or Russia. That's right. And is there anywhere contained in this 16 October 1963 memo? Well, as far as dates are concerned, well, you've seen the memo before. Do you see anything in there that indicates that he had said he wanted to travel to Russia? No, none whatsoever. Did you see anything in there? I can't recollect. Well, you have the memo in front of you. Well, I mean, I can't recollect the transcription. We will see if we can get that transcription. I want to thank you very much. I will conclude my questioning, and Mr. Bruton will now conclude the remaining session. Thank you, Mrs. Tarasoff, Mr. Tarasoff. Mr. Bruton, now I have given Mr. Tarasoff a receipt for that portable typewriter. When you send it back, have it in working order. Just for the record, do I have your consent to take that and run any tests on it? Yes, you certainly do. As I explained to you at some future date, the Select Committee on Assassinations of the House of Representatives may request your presence to appear and testify. Would you be willing to appear and testify before the Congress? Today is the transcription of your telephone tape between Lee Harvey Oswald and officials of the Soviet embassy. I have no objection as long as it would be a closed session, not a public thing. I have no objection. All right. Some of these are open to the public and blah, 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 blah. And all right. And so let me see if there's anything else of any importance. Looks like no. Then Mr. Blackmer says, I'm showing photographs taken from the publication Coup d'etat in America. These are photographs. I wonder if you could tell me if you recognize either one of those two. These were taken from pages 208 to 223 of the above book. Maybe we should read that. I got it. Remember, like I said, he names Emilio Santana as the shooter at the Daltex, which so do I. So he got something right. As far as the people are concerned, I wouldn't be able to recognize any of them because I was never shown any photos. Having been in Mexico City during this time period, I was wondering if you may have seen any of these people. Oh, you mean just casually on the street? No. Could I ask you if you knew Howard Hunt? Howard Hunt? Hunt? Is he a defector from Russia? I'll show you 3 photographs of Howard Hunt, and I ask you if you recall having seen this man in Mexico City in 1963 when you first arrived, whether it be at the embassy or on the street or at a party. No. Because as far as our contact with the embassy was very limited. Can I also ask you if you have ever been transcribing any of these tapes in Russian, if you ever heard the Russians discuss the fact that their embassy was broken into, or someone was attempting to burglarize their embassy? I cannot answer that positively because I don't remember. Very good. This concludes my questioning. That's from Mr. Blackmer. Mr. Bruton's back. He says, Mr. and Mrs. Tarasoff, I thank you very much for taking the time to discuss this both last night and tonight with us. I would request on behalf of Richard Sprague, Chief Counsel of the committee, that you do not discuss this. I can only make that as a request, blah, blah, blah. Same typical nonsensical jargon there. He goes, we're going back on the record for a brief question. I understand that you succeeded George Misko, M-I-S-K-O, who was familiar with the voices of the Russians in the Russian embassy because he did the translating of the tapes. Is that correct? That's correct. I would also like to ask you if you know if there was anybody else other than George Misko who was in the American embassy in September and October of 1963 and was familiar with the voices of the Russians in the Russian embassy other than yourself, as familiar as you were. Oh, I doubt it, for the simple reason that I had to deal with them day in, day out, and the people at the embassy would probably get a crack at them once in a while, which wouldn't give them sufficient basis to know people, to identify them. To identify the voices, to put them with people. To identify the voices, will put them with people, correct. Then I would like to ask you if anyone checked with you to verify whether or not you had an opinion as to who the voice on the other end of the call with Oswald on both of the conversations. No, not that I know of. Mrs. Tarasoff, do you know of anybody in the American embassy during that time that was familiar with the Russian voices as your husband? No, I don't think there really was, because the reason that they had him come down and they needed somebody that was proficient. There were some people that had slight knowledge of Russian, but as far as being proficient, no. Can I ask you, when you were talking about voice identity tapes that you made, putting the tape with the name, were those identity tapes made before or after the Oswald call? These tapes were made regularly. Do you recall having made them when you first came on, or was it sometime after? No, this was sometime after. Was it after the assassination? Yes, definitely. So there were no voice identity tapes that could match voices with during the time of these calls, unless the particular tape was kept for some reason. Later on, but at the time the tape was transcribed, there was no identity tape, and no one as proficient in Russian and knowing the voices than yourself. No, I don't think so. Very good. Thank you very much. We can conclude the interview now. And that is the end of the interview with both Tarasoffs from 1976. So when you Google this is on the Black Vault, which means that John Greenwald fucking requested this himself, which is amazing. When you Google the Tarasoffs and their interviews. All you get are the HSCA interviews from 1978, not this interview from 76. And it looks as though this was requested and only recently released as of 4/4/2018. So this is a good one. And so, like I said, we're going to continue on with the Tarasoffs for quite some time. We got at least 3-4 more days of their 1978 interviews. Plus, from there, we're going to get into Herb Manel and his wife. And, yeah, that's what we're doing. So if you haven't picked up a copy of my book, I'd really appreciate it if you picked up a copy of my book. I'm about to have some autographed ones here soon. They're $50 each for soft covers. I'll have them in hand in a couple, probably about 2 weeks. And yeah, that's it. So also, if you haven't subscribed to my Substack, I'd appreciate it if you did. Well, I guess that's it for today, guys. See you tomorrow.